I'd like to introduce you to Professor Lachlan Blackall, who will be taking you through this next plenary session. Lachlan.
Good afternoon, everyone. A real pleasure to welcome you to this session, and a real pleasure for me to be here as the session chair. So before I begin, please allow me to acknowledge the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we're all gathering today, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. So it's hopefully not going to come as a surprise to you for me to say that the threats of climate change are existential, and I think very eloquently summed up by our previous speaker. So obviously the threats of climate change stand to impact the environment around us, the weather, our water systems, our soil, our ecological systems. And as a consequence of that are really driving changes in how we think about infrastructure and the built environment that's around us. So in this session, I'm hoping that we have a chance to explore our ambition around a sustainable, resilient and decarbonised future. But importantly, we're going to discuss not just the path to get there, but also the really important skills that are going to be necessary to support this overall transition. So I'm delighted to have a panel here to work with us through these weighty topics, and I'll invite them to come up on stage. The structure of the session will be that we will have some short opening remarks from each of the panellists. Then we'll dive into sort of Q&A amongst ourselves before we obviously throw it open to those of you in the room and those of you online. So please join me in welcoming our very esteemed panel for this session. Scientia Professor Veena Sarjawala, who's the Director of the Smart Centre at the University of New South Wales. Veena. Tom McMahon, who's Deputy CEO of the Tech Council of Australia. And a fellow Territorian from the ACT, Associate Professor Bradley Mogridge, Kamilaroi Water Scientist from the University of Canberra. Well, as I take my seat, Veena, I might ask you to come up and make your opening remarks.
Thanks very much, Lachlan. I guess from the perspective of as you know, and I just wanted to pick up on what our previous speaker has said, and it's very moving. You can't help but feel for people, and I mean, of course, we've all heard about how Tuvalu and many of our neighbours are confronted with the stark realities of what, of course, climate change is imposing on them. So I guess I wanted to just pick up on a couple of these key points, that we do need to take our responsibility seriously if we are going to talk about looking after our friends in the Pacific, if we are going to sort of talk about how we build infrastructure and how we build homes, how we deliver, I guess, what should be expected by all human beings on this planet is safety and how we actually have a safe roof over our heads. And in that regard, I guess it comes to this point about how we're going to actually advance a sustainable future in the context of how we're going to deliver more of that green manufacturing perspective. So it's not just enough to say, well, either we do it in a large scale and make it absolutely cost effective, or we're not going to do it at all. And I think, to me, we've got to stop and reflect who we are as human beings, the values that we place on ourselves, which is, if we are going to move towards sustainability, there are three pillars. Yes, there is the economic and the environmental aspects, but the other important point, of course, are the societal needs and communities we work with in many remote and regional communities right here in Australia. And it is heartbreaking, because I think, you hear a lot of stories about how expensive it is to be able to, particularly in many remote communities, to afford I guess solutions, housing solutions, for instance. Because of course, as we've seen over the last several years with the impact of COVID, supply chains being impacted, of course, building products and many of these kinds of, materials and products that we need in creating housing solutions, infrastructure, all of that has been impacted. And of course, you can sort of hear all these stories are going, well, a lot of these large infrastructure, buildings and others are not happening anymore or have been delayed. But on the other hand, if there are people who are waiting to, rebuild homes, and what we see, of course, people who are absolutely devastated with the heartbreaking conditions that they have to face, whether it is the bushfires and floods and so on. So I think in understanding the bigger picture, we have to ask the question in a way that says, we can't afford to say anymore that, well, that's somebody else's problem. I think we all have to first and foremost recognize that it is our collective responsibility. And when you hear professors, like the Vice Chancellor of USP talking about building capacity, delivering, solutions for people, I think we all have to sort of take stock and say that the innovative solutions that we talk about as to how you deliver infrastructure, how do you actually build homes, we're going to have to start to bring sustainability into picture so that we can actually start to show that there are multiple ways in which we can deliver on green manufacturing solutions, so that the ability to do it in a localized and a regionalized setting is important, because you can't just assume that your supplies of products are going to come from somewhere overseas and then they're just going to land on our doorsteps, let's say in the larger capital cities, Sydney, Melbourne, so on, and we can afford to pay, some for some of these goods. But what about many of those remote communities where, it is an important question of balancing sustainability, affordability. So I guess part of this, the cost factor in all of this, and this does connect to sustainability, is that we can't afford to then keep talking sustainability and yet say it's okay to import products over long distances, because let's not forget that transport does contribute to carbon emissions. So if we're going to talk about holistic solutions, you have to take into account that the more localized and regionalized production you can do, the better outcomes you will see in terms of lowering that carbon mileage as goods move around. So the interconnectivity in all of this is, when we talk about sustainability, the other side of it is, of course, how do communities manage some of the challenges in terms of waste and recycling. So there are lots of interconnected questions, and of course we see this time and time again where many communities who've been impacted by lack of services in terms of what's not available because you're so far away and so you're so remote that you may not have some of these services, like the waste services that we all take for granted. So I guess part of the bigger picture in understanding, of course, and getting to, having realistic solutions for sustainability have to take into account, of course, we're talking about humanity at the core of everything we've been talking about in the last couple of days. So how are we going to look after people, particularly many disadvantaged communities that we know are going to be impacted? So part of what we like to think is that as we start to talk about green manufacturing solutions, the ability to have more decentralized, solutions for manufacturing products, whether it's for our homes and for the everyday things that communities need, it's going to be extremely important that we support and encourage a lot of small-scale production where, of course, you can empower local communities, and we need to start to think about very different business models. So your supply chains could be connected with a lot of local communities that can all be a part of creating those local jobs and providing those local services. So one of the solutions we're developing at UNSW is our micro factories that allow us to show that we can deploy these at the right scale and produce fit-for-purpose products that can be used, for instance, in building applications. So these are kinds of things, I guess, in terms of us getting to that point of what does it take, of course, as we're working with our small community partners. One of the things we really feel excited about is to see the passion and excitement where bringing together people who are interested in taking on those career paths and staying in their communities. So they don't want to move away from home, and home is where of course, they would choose to live. So part of the ability to think localized and regionalized production and capacity building in that way means that we need to be able to start to think in that holistic manner by bringing some of these opportunities in a far better distributed fashion where the needs are. I think we're going to enable, in a holistic way, the ability to develop these net zero industries of the future, deliver, of course, and build capacity in the local regions. So I just wanted to kind of, I guess, leave it with that point that how we shape that sustainable future, there's no such thing as one size fits all. And I think we need to be very, very flexible in the way we think about where our communities' needs are and how do we, I guess, empower communities to be part of the solution. And we're all learning as we go, but our experiences so far have been, really positive. And we're just, thrilled that there are so many opportunities to take technology and engineering into a whole new way of designing and defining what a successful, business model looks like that is built on the principles of sustainability. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Tom, can I invite you to say a few words?
Sure.
G'day everyone. Is that coming through fine, audio-wise? Thank you very much for having me here today. I'd have to say that the imposter syndrome does escalate somewhat when you see a panel of professors and then me as an industry lobbyist, but I'll do my best to match the intellectual quality of the other contributions. Also, it wasn't acknowledged in my intro, but also from the ACT, so good to be here in Sydney to talk to you today about a sustainable future and skills for net zero industries. So what does the tech sector have to do with this question? So I'm the Deputy CEO of the Tech Council of Australia. We're Australia's industry association for the direct tech industry in our country. We're a pretty new industry association. We launched last year. We have 160 member companies. And we've been recently doing a bunch of work on sustainability issues, as well as a whole bunch of work on skills issues. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the confluence of those two things in my introductory remarks. The tech sector in Australia in many ways represents where we want to go as a country in terms of having important growth engines of our economy that are not coupled with carbon emissions. So the tech sector globally emits very little carbon for the amount of economic activity that it generates, and also invests significantly in achieving reductions in emissions that are generated as part of the activity of those companies. So we see, TCA member companies have very aggressive net zero targets in the 2030s and 40s rather than out to 2050. And they're investing in renewable energy to make that work. One of the main areas that there are carbon emissions from the tech sector is in cloud, so in operating computers, in data centres. One of the challenges there is in ensuring that they can run overnight with zero emissions technology. So there's a lot of investment being done in that space. Our member companies are also investing in new companies that are directly applying technology to solve climate issues, ranging from small Australian startups to, I attended a speech by our board chair, Rob Denholm, who's the chair of Tesla. Clearly, there's exciting potential in terms of growing new companies that are directly looking to address climate issues. And thirdly, there's investment in, renewable energy purchasing power agreements, which is much more disproportionate than our economic share of activity. So the tech sector in Australia has something like 13% of purchasing power agreements for renewable energy, despite only having 4% share of the economy, so that's clearly disproportionate. And worldwide, it's actually much more significant. So around half of the purchasing power agreements worldwide have been purchased by tech companies. In Australia, the number's a bit lower because of the other significant industries that are looking to abate their probably much more significant carbon emissions than the tech sectors. And where does this lead to the skills question? In many ways, I think sustainable industries and the tech sector in Australia have overlapping skills issues, which is that Australia is not generating sufficient engineering and technology talent, and hasn't been for a long time to keep up with the growth in these exciting new industries that people want to work in. So we've been doing a lot of thinking about how we can improve the awareness of the jobs that exist in technology, how we can bring in more diverse talent into tech jobs. So only 1 in 10 people studying software engineering in Australia is a woman, and only 1 in 4 people working in the tech sector in Australia is a woman. So clearly there are significant areas to grow the talent pool within Australia. And I really think, building alliances across the economy for other areas that also need that talent and are looking to grow it through our universities and vocational education system in Australia is going to be critical to achieving change. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Bradley, can I invite you?
Yam everyone, Brad Mogwitch, Kilroy Man, and Tom, I don't know if, I think we're in amongst greatness, so I'm just, as my kids call me, I'm just an arse pro. So I'm well and truly down the pecking order, which they obviously love saying. Look, I suppose I'm coming from a different point of view. Take you back, talk a bit about some old knowledge that's not being utilised for future decisions and also modern decisions and also informing science. I want to pitch that, Indigenous people on the Australian continent, 300 odd different language groups, 600 plus different dialects, all have their own language, law, customs, values, connections, stories. So I think it's that diversity is not really picked up in the way we look at Indigenous Australia. And then obviously the challenge of Indigenous people to be, to evolve and survive. We've even survived government policy, so we're still going. And I think the challenge for us is we have resilience, we have survival built in. You think about, we're on the driest inhabited continent on Earth. We have thousands of generations of knowledge and connection and observation, which is a part of science. And how we test country and how we get results and how we replicate that. And I believe it's, replication is survival, and we're still here. My country is northwest New South Wales. We have many rivers, we have the Great Artesian Basin under us, we have strong connections to those water places, but we don't have a say in water and how it's managed and how it's shared. So really my pitch is, normally I used to call it a blueprint because it was water-based, but now I'm calling it a black print, based on what my list of demands are, my recommendations. It's more around how we perceive Indigenous knowledge as well. So knowledge is obviously something that is acquired, and for Indigenous people it's passed on, and a lot of that knowledge through observation is through impacts from country itself and how we see country, how we connect country, and things that have happened in our history. So, things like climate change. We've already survived climate change. When the last at the end of the last ice age, coastal people had to move to higher country and adapt because the sea level started encroaching on their country. So they were moving up. Like even the Sydney Harbour, I've no doubt, the people down there in the flooded river valley of Sydney Harbour, there would have been people up the top saying, oh, that mob down there, and then all of a sudden that mob down there is up on their country, up top of the escarpment because of sea level rise. So adapting is a part of Indigenous knowledge as well. So, the other challenge is how we perceive knowledge, Indigenous knowledge. So it was put into the realm of fiction, myth and legend and fable. So it was perceived as sort of a fake story, you know, and I suppose what we're trying to do now is turn the tables and flip that and say that our knowledge is evidence, you know, of our survival, but also of our adapting to change. And obviously, you know, potentially now we're beyond mitigation. We've got to adapt. The climate's changed. We're in that. And I think what I've heard over the last few days is, you know, we have these impacts, you know, you just got to think about the last 25, 30 years. We've had the 2 worst on record droughts. We forget about those fish kills in the Lower Darling that impacted Aboriginal people severely. They were only seen as storytellers. Their knowledge wasn't seen as evidence. They weren't seen as scientific experts on those 2 independent science panels that were created by the government and also, you know, the academy. So we weren't seen as experts. And then they rolled out Uncle Badger Bates at the end when they produced the reports. Lucky the 2 sciences, the 2 scientific bodies, the evidence and the results spoke to each other. So that would have been a bad day for science if they didn't. But I think the moving our knowledge from the realm of fiction and fable to evidence, you know, that's where I'm pushing now. And, you know, that I think I was just recently a co-lead author of the State of the Environment report for inland water, and there was obviously a climate change chapter and extreme events. I think we had 11 Indigenous authors, elite authors, and we missed out on, they couldn't actually find anyone for air quality and Antarctica. So we had a voice in the recent State of the Environment report, and what I found, I couldn't find any evidence to measure the health of country. So no jurisdictions, no one's collecting traditional knowledge and the impacts of knowledge, and also to get a baseline to see where we are in the health of country. So the Bureau of Meteorology has all this data, Geoscience Australia, CSIRO, all the agencies, universities collect a lot of data, but I couldn't see any of my data. And I suppose that was the big push. And then also, one last one, you know, I was one of 3 Indigenous authors to contribute to the last IPCC AR6. So we were contributing authors, not lead authors. So I suppose we were at the behest of the lead authors to be invited. We got 600 words in AR6. So, you know, but when that was produced in Working Group 2 document. Working Group 1 document was the science. And, you know, there was, I call them excuses. The Indigenous and local knowledges are used most extensively by IPCC Working Group 2. That was Chapter 1, page 40. And then Chapter 1, page 115. The Indigenous and local knowledges include information about past and present climate states. That's what I'm saying. However, assessing this knowledge and integrating it with scientific literature remains a challenge. That's the excuse. Challenge. Surely, in 2022, we've got to move beyond a challenge. The lack of assessment capability and integration leads to most Working Group 1 chapters still not including Indigenous and local knowledge in their assessment findings. Working Group 1, just do better. AR7, potentially, we might see Indigenous lead authors. We've seen it in SOE. I think that's our next challenge. Thanks.
Brilliant. I think lots to unpack there, and when I was putting together the questions for the session, I had thought it would go down quite a technology specific focus. But I think just to pick up on the theme from the presentations is that we can talk a lot about technology, but actually there's a huge amount about people, because people are being impacted here, and ultimately technology should be built in the service of the people who are going to use them. So I thought we might actually start the questions off for the panel around on that notion that we actually are building technologies for people, how do we best engage with the community to ensure that what we're building works best for them? So, Tom, I'm going to start with you, if that's all right, and then I'll throw over to the other panellists.
Yeah, no, so I think, this has been a really important question for us at the Tech Council. I think a really big challenge for the tech industry in Australia is that there's been a narrative that technology is a threat to economic well-being and that it's a threat to jobs, that automation will lead to fewer jobs and lead to a poorer society, whereas actually the evidence shows the exact opposite of that being true. And a large part of what we've seen as our communications job at the Tech Council has been to talk about the benefits, the economic benefits for Australians of working in tech. I mean, clearly all of us who use technology on a day-to-day basis have reasons for doing so, but nonetheless, like the rapid change that's happened in the industry, I think has left people perhaps perplexed as to what is going on and what the opportunities are. We ran a bunch of focus groups across Australia, and many people are like, look, these jobs aren't really going to stay in Australia, they're going to go overseas, it's too expensive to build technology in Australia, so no one's going to do it. That's at the same time that all of our member companies are finding it impossible to hire talent in Australia because there's just so much demand for jobs here. So I think it's a really important question. I think, it's incumbent on those people who have a leadership role to communicate the benefits of it, which is one thing that we've been doing. There's 860,000 people working in the tech sector in Australia, highest paid, fastest growing jobs in the economy. So that's a key story that we've been telling to sort of reduce that fear factor, I guess, and get people excited about the opportunities because, as I mentioned in my kind of opening remarks, not enough people are seeing this as an opportunity, which is making it really hard for the industry to grow because there just isn't that talent pool to draw upon.
Yeah, thanks very much. Brad, Vina?
I think I didn't actually tell you my black print, did I? Not my blueprint for the future. But yeah, I think how can we include Indigenous knowledge in that, and I suppose it's indigenising academia and the curricula, starting from, the school kids that are outside, getting them to engage with it and understand it and learn it, and then moving through, schools to universities. It's part of university teaching in a lot of areas, and I think there's an opportunity then to obviously attract Indigenous people to the STEM. Like, we struggle to get Indigenous people in STEM. Like, it's been a challenge. It's been tough. I'm only 21, and it is a challenge. Like, we don't we've got a number of delegates, members here, Indigenous members of. We've got an inaugural meeting of our national Indigenous STEM professional network. So we don't have a network per se. Like Aboriginal dentists have a network. Holy moly! So we're way behind. But I think we have to get Indigenous people in this space, especially around ideas around solutions, but also looking back to look forward. Know where you come from, and having those aspects of if country's sick, people are sick. If we look after country, country will look after us. Those sort of common sort of themes. Is that we want to be part of it. We want to be part of this revolution to actually care for country properly. We got, I think my latest pitch was a 234-year recovery plan for this continent. That's what we need.
Can I maybe just drill into that a little bit? You talked about the challenge of sort of integrating different knowledge systems. Have you seen it done well anywhere? And if so, how has it been done well?
Yeah, look, I suppose the best example would be the cultural fire scenario. So like savannah burning and thinking about the right fire for the right country, and using that as offsets as well. But I would also like to push in the water space as well. Is that a lot of our cities have water places that were significant to Aboriginal people. A lot of them are covered by concrete, or we have concrete channels that get stormwater from A to B as fast as you can. And whereas Australia's a pretty flat country, so we want to slow water down. How can we rehydrate this country? Like wetlands. They are a key part. Like, look what the settlers did to the tank stream. You know, it was a natural spring, beautiful water, would have been a significant place, and then all of a sudden it becomes a waste dump, and you know the sewage output. You know, so I suppose it's also then how we value our natural resources and how we value country, how we value water. That needs to shift as well.
Pina, I might come to you. You talked a lot about the microfactories that you're designing, but so in the context of actually engaging with community, how do you work with different communities to actually get the outcomes that each of them want? Because I assume they're quite different depending on the types of communities and depending on where they're located.
Exactly, yeah. Now let me give you one example. So I've been building collaboration early stages with some incredibly fantastic people who are in and around the Tamworth area and going all the way up to Walgett. So for us, one of the things that was becoming obvious through these sort of early stages of discussing how we're going to co-design that collaboration project was, can we think of a way in which the work that they're doing in their community, which is, there's lots of conversations around health and well-being, obviously both physical and mental health, and this is not just about kids, but the full sort of spectrum of community, and that's important because I guess, it's about bringing everyone on that journey, and from our perspective, one feedback really that we got was good to have. So as we're thinking about how we design these microfactories that are going to be fit for purpose is to be able to say, okay, well, if this is going to become a part of what happens in educational context, so it's not necessarily, I'm not talking about formal education, but even that informal setting where, if, for instance, this particular individual is holding local camps and all of that's happening, why don't we start to bring a lot of that STEM-related conversation? So part of what we're doing with that microfactory example is we're going to actually target it very much towards the kinds of products that he wants to actually show. So yes, it could be examples of some bush food that he's obviously an expert in. But what he was basically saying is that if we were to then say, for instance, bring solutions of taking a lot of those waste materials, putting that back into manufacture and remanufacture, all of that then becomes part of creating more and more training tools. And so if we were then to create solutions that ultimately are fit for, let's say, 3D printing or some of these other solutions, and that was something that he came up with because, hey, by the way, there's a guy who is in our community who runs this little hobby workshop and he's got a few 3D printers. How can we bring him into the picture? So part of that, you're absolutely right. We had to spend some time to understand where there's already a lot of local interest, whether it is coming in through hobbies or kids getting excited about it. But what our collaborators basically saying is, for him to drive that program at the context of what matters to him and to his community. So yes, STEM could come in as part of these microfactories being deployed, but literally then the next step is how does he then take those solutions, and yes, if it is, taking our microfactories on the back of a truck, now we haven't done that yet, of course, but the point being that if those were the kinds of aspirations we have to develop together, it's got to come from the point of view of what is the purpose. So we're literally sort of working on that journey where we're saying it's about the microfactories, but more importantly, it's about what is the purpose in terms of what that community and multiple communities where he engages. So the good thing for us is that, his presence as someone who is a local in that community and running and hosting a lot of these camps means that he is the champion who's going to take this forward for us, and we're going to be supporting some of the initiatives. So I think that's a great way to picture what collaboration could look like. Now, he's not someone who necessarily knows about our world, but by the same token, we don't know a lot about his world. So I think the best thing we've done by coming together is we come from two very different worlds. He's obviously more into community medicine and community work, and from our perspective, bringing some of that kind of thinking together. I think we've come up with a few ideas that we will obviously be trialing next year.
Really interesting. I'm going to sort of try and change the tack a little bit and sort of move now towards sort of the skills focus. And so as I'm doing that, I would just we've had a couple of people who are sending questions in via the app, but if you've got questions that you'd like to actually post so that we can get to them, please feel free to use the QR code that's up on screen at the moment. So we've talked, about what the future sort of needs, and we've touched on the skills thing, but I'd like to drill into the skills a little bit more and just sort of, what are the skills that we desperately need, and, can we quantify sort of the number of people we're going to need to have those skills over the next couple of decades? Tom, do you want to kick us off there?
Yeah, thankfully we've done some work on this, so I'm not going to be making it up. So we've got a goal in the tech sector of having 1.2 million people working in tech jobs in Australia by 2030, which is a shared goal with the Australian government. And, that's clearly significantly more people. I mentioned the 860,000 figure, but that's significantly more people than are working now. But also you've got to account for the fact that, many people are going to retire and there's attrition from the industry. So we need hundreds of thousands of more people working in the tech sector. And we've identified some really key barriers that exist there and some areas where there's priority roles for us. And the most challenging jobs to fill there are on the more technical end. Because there's not an adjacent workforce. So, I work in the tech sector, but I came from a policy background and I didn't need special retraining in order to come into the industry. Whereas if you are doing, developing machine learning algorithms, you probably need to have specialist training, right? So those technical jobs are the really challenging ones to fill. And there are a few key reasons why we're not getting enough people into them. One of them is awareness, and I think awareness is a massive one. Just not enough people are aware of the opportunity. If you talk to parents because they haven't worked in the industry, or if you talk to school teachers or counsellors at school, they're not aware of the opportunity, so people end up going and studying law or economics, important professions, but nonetheless, there are massive job opportunities in tech. And another one, I think, which is really important is that although vocational education and training can play a massive role, it's currently not working very well. So we know that only 40% of people who do a IT-related vet qualification go on to have a better job than when they started, which is not a great outcome by any means. But we think that, around 1 in 4 jobs in the sector could be filled through a vet pathway. And so we really need to improve the kind of quality of delivery and curriculum there. Another really, a big opportunity, I think, is that around half the people who study an IT-related course at uni in Australia are international students, but only 1 in 2 of those people remain in Australia. And we really think that a lot could be done to encourage more people who've come to Australia to study tech-related degrees to stay here and work in the industry so that we can grow our skills base over time.
Yeah, great. Brad, as I come across to you, I'd be keen to understand, not just the skills, but where those skills are going to come from. So who's going to be providing them? Is it universities? Is it vet? Are there other pathways for education that we're not yet tapping that we should be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I suppose, how do we attract people to universities, but also, promote those opportunities at vet, and obviously have TAFE, or we have CIT in Canberra, but it's those sort of opportunities, certificate 2, 3 or 4 or degree or graduate diploma. So it's obviously making sure that those courses are there for starters, and then how can you attract those people to those courses? Like, it's how do we make it more sexy? I don't know. Because it's a real challenge. Like, you mentioned in Indigenous world, a lot go to the health and law and education. They are all huge issues for our communities, and they're all part of closing the gap. And I think for this recent round of closing the gap, caring for country has become a measure on how Indigenous peoples and their well-being is increasing when they're caring for country, and how is country responding, and decarbonising could be part of that. Aboriginal people own large chunks of land in Northern Australia, for instance, and how can we build solar farms that have dual purpose, like bush foods that are harvestable, and then they can actually go to the international market. Why can't that happen? I think there's opportunities, obviously, the savanna burning and knowledge around that, fire, reshaping landscapes, thinking differently, looking through Indigenous eyes around landscapes. How can we shift from concrete jungles to bringing back flowing water and things like that. So, yeah.
I think, another really important point to make is that these jobs are great, high-paid, fast-growing jobs, but they're undertaken by a relatively small subsector of the community. It's mainly men, it's mainly white men. And so if you go into a university degree and there's no one there that looks like you, no one who has your background or experience, it can be really challenging to be like, do I fit in here? And I think, we need to do better as an industry to highlight those success stories where they exist from, underrepresented groups, be that Indigenous Australians. Women is clearly not an underrepresented group, but it's underrepresented in tech. And how do we highlight those stories? But also, how do we do better as an industry to make sure that, when people land in jobs in the sector, they feel like they belong and that they have a role to play?
Yeah, I think the diversity and inclusion point is well made, and there were a couple of prior sessions today that really dove into it. So we might not spend too much time on that, but the one thing I did want to do was just very parochially, as a fellow of ATSE, the Academy's been focused on building a diversity and inclusion toolkit for STEM-based SMEs over the last few years. And that toolkit is now reaching a point where it's towards the end of its first trial. It's going to be rolled out either later this year or early next. And so just putting it out there that there is a focus on this, and the Academy's playing a particularly strong role in supporting that. Bradley, I'm going to pick up one of your questions though, and I'm going to hand it to Vina, which is, ultimately, how do we make sustainability sexy and communicate to people that they want to be, studying at university? I'm picking up some of the questions here. How do we communicate that people should be, want to study, or that we need to have the study of chemistry and physics and maths and so on? So what's been your experience in how we make people attracted to actually getting these skills?
Yeah, I think we need to not start, bombarding young people with, I think, that kind of focus on, is it about chem, is it about physics, is it about maths? I think first we've got to start with, in a way, what is it that they want to do in their lives in that bigger sense, or what is it that they're passionate about? And yes, if it is working with people and communities and sustainability and technology and all of that, I think to me the purpose and the passion has to be established first. And in a way, some of the things that we did do in the work when we were working, particularly through engaging with kids, where we were taking them out to site visits, to factory floors and so on, just to be able to say, okay, well, we won't keep you in the classroom and tell you about is this chemistry or materials or whatever, but rather let's take you out into the world of, where different things are being made or what is being treated or whatever the case might be, and to see that as the purpose. And I guess then start to think about, once you do get excited about all of these things that we need, that are building blocks in our lives, what is it that you would want to do? And I guess one of the questions I posed to, and this was part of the Science 50/50 program that I was doing, was asking the young women, what would they do better? And they were not shy in saying, oh, well, actually, we can do that better, we can do this better. And I think, to me, this is the point. It's about wanting to feel like the opportunity to make a difference, and to do it in a way that you're not afraid to speak out. And I think, to me, part of what we do in terms of developing skills, first and foremost, is to enable that ability to say, I can see all these different things that I would love to do. And I think once you get to that point where, particularly as a young person, you can get excited about, there are so many different things I could be doing, and the fact that there are all these career pathways, whether it is in services, water, or it is in manufacturing, or it is in different kinds of manufacturing industries. I think it's about first seeing that I would see myself, I would love to work in these areas. And then, yes, if it is then learning skills related to tech, for example, that will be a given. Kids who are using laptops and stuff in their schools are just used to doing that. So I think it's not as if the technologies that are needed are not going to happen. But I think we're missing that first step. Maybe that's the bit, and that experience sort of opening doors and pathways is important.
Fantastic. I could keep going with all the questions that I have, but I'd love to throw it open to the room. If there are any questions amongst the audience here, if you wanted to raise their hands. Up the back.
Hi, I just have a question. It's a comment, then a question. I grew up in very remote Australia as an Aboriginal woman, or girl, a little girl. And I didn't finish school. I knew I was really good at maths, but at 40 years of age, 20 years ago now, I went to university and studied for the first time. I studied a computer science degree, and ever since, all I've wanted to do is connect kids to culture and technology. And for us, as kids growing up, it's about our culture. And we don't make that connection to technology. We just don't. We think about our country and our mob, and that's what matters to us. So it's about, like, being at your micro factories in communities is great, but it's still coming from a top-down approach because it's coming with all these expectations around manufacturing or around recycling, or if culture hubs is what I think about, is creating data centres, if you like, on country where children actually are going out to the bush, they're learning their culture with their elders, and elders or knowledge rangers are digitally translating those back. From that point, whether you love art and drawing or whether you love numbers or your culture, you can be an entrepreneur online, you can be an engineer, you can be involved in manufacturing, designing, developing, innovation, all of those things that involve technology. That's the link that we need to focus on. That way we're not extracting our knowledges out of our countries, away from our people. Our elders are respected, their knowledges are respected, and children grow up knowing that they will be valued.
Yeah, I think a point very well made.
The question is, do you think that works from a ground-up approach? From, for example, water, recycling, technology learning?
Yeah. Brad, would you like to?
Me?
Yeah.
I have strong connection to that, obviously, Susan, and I think it's, me being very, I'll admit it, I've been very privileged. I grew up in Western Sydney, was able to get a good education, went to university and things like that, so it's, I now try and use that privilege to be a voice where our voices have never been, and I think we need to see our heroes, like we've got, yourself in tech, we've got a supercomputer whiz, we've got a chemist, we've got a mathematician modelling fire, and this little water scientist. So, we've got to see our heroes out there as well, and that's part of it, to say that, give those kids hope that are on country, and the kids that Corey might inspire with deadly science, but what happens to them next? Where do they go? Do we need on-country classrooms? Do we need on-country degrees? That could be something that academia could think about, of taking a degree which is the two-way, so you've got elders and scientists working together to teach, or lecturers and things like that. So, that could be an option. Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, that's fantastic suggestions there. Look, we are getting close to time, and my inclination is always to push the boundaries, but I'm going to try and be well behaved today. So do we have one more question from the floor? I saw a couple of other hands.
I'm Cynthia Nolan, and my question is to the Tech Council of Australia, which I'm delighted that there is one. What's your link with the Department of Education and the world of schools? Because just hearing, some of the things you were saying, there's a lot of things that are already happening within schools, so I'd love to understand how you're connecting with that.
Yeah, so one of the
one of the barriers that we identified through our research in terms of improving the skills base of Australia in terms of tech, which I didn't mention, is fragmentation. There's, across the different layers of government that we have in Australia, civil society, industry bodies, companies themselves directly, everyone's got like their own little, initiative that they think is going to change the world. It's sort of like standards, the problem we have with the last standard, then you have a new standard, right? And so I think, what we want to do is play a kind of coordinating role, I think, but looking at what's working well and how can we scale it up. And as part of that, obviously, engagement with the Department of Education, both at a federal level, but also at states. We were engaging, we had the Jobs and Skills Summit in Canberra recently, where we were lucky to have a few reps from the tech industry in Australia. And as part of that, one idea that we put forward was about a virtual work experience for school students in Australia, so that people, regardless of where they are in Australia, can see the opportunities that exist in the tech sector and get a small inkling of what a job would be like in the industry, which is something that we're pushing forward, which the government was keen on and adopted as part of the communique that came out of that summit. So absolutely engaging closely with both the Department of Employment and Department of Education. That's kind of our job, I guess, in Canberra, is to be that link between industry and government, to make sure that we can sort of look at what are the initiatives that are working well, how can we bring industry into that as well, so that once people have decided that they're keen and interested, they can start to learn about what the job opportunities that are that follow study. So yeah, lots more to do, but it's definitely an area that we're keen to work in.
And just a final question, are you working closely with the Australian Computing Society? Because they're also in a similar space and they are running initiatives which bring industry and schools, etc. So
so I guess the ACS is, for those who aren't aware, they've been around for a much longer time than the Tech Council is, and we really respect their experience and the programs that they have over many areas. So we're engaging closely with the ACS to make sure that we are kind of working together rather than at cross purposes. So yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I think that probably brings us to a nice point. For those of you who aren't avid budget watchers, you'd be good to note, obviously, that the federal government announced a very significant skills package in the most recent budget that goes directly to a lot of what we have talked about today. And I think from listening to the way they're talking about it, I think it points to a very positive focus on the fact that we're going to need to support lots of new skills for lots of new jobs that are coming in future to support our ambition to have a sustainable, decarbonised and resilient future. We are going to wrap up there, so I'd ask you to join me in thanking the panel for their contributions. And we will hand over to Nate to take us off to afternoon tea. Thank you very much.
Please thank Lachlan.